Hi, I'm Rachel Morgan, a retail sales consultant who works with retailers that are underperforming to help them increase their sales and also their retention. Today, I am super excited. I've invited Hayleigh to come on and chat about all things podcast. And if you're not familiar with who Hayleigh is, she is the founder of Espresso Podcast Production, a full-service podcast agency that helps business owners and brands start, grow, and manage podcasts to reach their right audience to increase their revenue and community. And let's get her on here so she can better explain who she is and what she does. Share and has a passion for storytelling, which is always a good thing when it comes to sales. And her life mission is really to amplify the voices of those and spread knowledge. So, hello, Hayleigh.
Hello. Hey, how are you?
Wonderful.
Oh
Thank you for joining.
my gosh, thanks so much for having me on. I'm so excited for this
Yes,
conversation today.
yes. Well, I'm really excited because I think that this is a really fabulous conversation for if you're interested in being a podcast host or maybe even being on a podcast, right? How can we be more effective in actually, the time that we spend doing it? How can we see some ROI? How can we make better connections with those that we speak to? So I'm super excited. Thank you.
Totally. Yeah, that ROI is a big piece of podcasting for businesses, and I love helping them be able to figure that out.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Hayleigh, can you tell us a little bit more about yourself and how you got into podcasting?
Definitely. Yeah. So, like Rachel said, my name is Hayleigh Hayhurst. I'm the owner of Espresso Podcast Production. I run a full service podcast agency specializing in editing, marketing, and strategy. I started off my podcasting journey in 2017 when I was in college and had a podcast with a friend. Never really thought that it would take us anywhere, but during that time we were, learning production, learning promotion, all these things that go into having a podcast. So fast forward, it was during the pandemic. I had just graduated from college. I was laid off and moved up to Seattle. And a connection of mine knew I had a podcast and she had a podcast and her business, she had an online business in 2020. So it was growing very fast. And she was like, I don't have time. Can you run this for me? And that was my first taste into podcast production for other people. I didn't know that it was an actual career choice at that
Yeah.
time, but fast forward now, 4.5 years later, I've been doing this full time since I started. And thank you. I specialize in helping businesses and brands start their podcasts that will actually get them the clients that they want and the results that they want. I started off doing strategy about 2 years ago, maybe 2.5 years ago, because I would have these amazing clients with amazing podcasts, but I would see holes in what they were doing. And I was like, if you just said this a little bit different, or if you had a freebie that connected, your podcast to your business or funnels or whatever it might be, it's different for everyone. I was like, you would be able to, make this work for your business. So I'm sure we'll get into all of that, but that is kind of more about what I do.
Yeah, I love that you started with your own podcast. So
Yeah.
you definitely know what it's like to have this vision, want to start something, create it. You had to figure it out on your own, right? And then it turned into a business where now you work with others. You help them kind of through that journey. And there certainly is so much more to podcasting than meets the eye. Just the editing, the production, the marketing, the selling of it, right? Getting people on there, right? It's not just as simple as saying, "Hey, I want to have a podcast," right? But it is exciting when you decide you want that. So I love that you have all that knowledge and you can share it with us.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah, I know. I love it. And I think that, everyone is like, oh, everyone has a podcast, but that's just not true. And it really is a great marketing tool. And if you can figure out how to stand out, which is what I love helping my clients with, then it can really be a great revenue source for you. I mean, I think nowadays, like people are craving more long form content, but you can definitely create short form content from your podcast episodes as well. So it's like the best of both
Yeah,
worlds.
that is really interesting that you said you think people are craving more long form content. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, I think that for a while, I know this, for me specifically, and just from people I've been talking to, like TikTok was huge. It is still
Mm-hmm.
huge. It's
Mm-hmm.
great. I definitely was addicted to TikTok. Still am. I had to delete the whole app. But
Yeah.
I've like found myself, and I'm hearing this a lot, is people are going more towards YouTube or more towards podcasts. And I think TikTok and short form content is great for kind of hooking you and, introducing you to so many new topics. You could see what, 60 videos in an hour?
Mm-hmm.
Like that's insane to think about. And so we're introduced to all of these new topics, and one is going to stick out to you. What I love about podcasting is you can, when you're a host, you'll definitely be working with keywords to make sure that your episodes are found. And so if you're having hour-long episodes on a specific topic, then that episode will definitely be found for years to come just because it's something that people are looking up. And so I think for why I think long form content will never, never, ever die is because people want to know the deeper reason behind things. So whether you're in the wellness space or the
Yeah.
sales space or marketing, or even just like, I don't know, anything. People want to know deeper. And so that's really where podcasts come into play.
That's very interesting because I feel like I actually want things a little bit quicker. Like I just want to get right to the
Mm.
point. And maybe
Yeah.
that's because of TikTok. But I actually just read something that said that the newest, youngest generation actually uses YouTube more than anything now.
Yeah.
So I thought that was interesting because I do think YouTube is a great source for learning more, but as well as podcasts, right? Because you get more into the conversation, like you're
Yeah.
saying. So my question for you is having like a podcast is seems like a very trendy thing right now. Everyone wants to get on it. They see the opportunity of it, right? The like you said, it can be heard many years down the road, right? So it's not always just like on Instagram where you share a post and it lives for like maybe 24, 48 hours, right? It's something that can always be there. And well, technically your content should always do that too. But you get my point. And so I'm kind of wondering, like, do you feel everyone should have a podcast? And what are some things maybe you should be considering if you're thinking about a podcast?
That's a great question. So I think that, yes, in a way, podcasts can be seen as trendy, but honestly, I don't see it that way just because it is such like an informational source, and it's not going to be something that dies out in the next couple years. I definitely think that podcasts are going to be a lot around forever. They've been around forever. I know someone that has had their podcast for the last 13 years, and I got started in this industry about 7 years ago. So it's been around for a long time, and I think it is growing in popularity as the days, the years go on. And it's almost like I can see like a trendy thing of being like, oh, I love listening to podcasts. I love listening to this sort of podcast. It's almost like a hobby for some people
Yeah,
now. You know what I mean? Like definitely
absolutely.
listening to podcasts can be a hobby. So, okay, what was your question again? Sorry, I
Yeah.
just like get on
No,
these excited
no.
tangents.
I definitely hear from more people now. I love listening to podcasts. I think that is definitely
Yeah.
something that people are gravitating towards, which is interesting because I'm not actually an audio learner. So for me, it's really hard to like sit
Okay.
there and just listen because I want to take
Yeah.
notes. Like that is how I process it. So I'm always like, oh, I need to listen to this episode, but I need to like be able to sit down and like fully listen to it, right? Like I can't,
Yeah.
it's hard for me. So, but I know it's a very popular thing to be doing right now. And I maybe that's because we all live very full lives, and so it's really easy to listen to it in the
Mhm.
car or while you're cleaning. Or,
Yeah.
I don't know. Anyways, that was not the question. But like, so the question is, do you feel everyone should have a podcast? We'll start there.
Yeah, that's a great question. Personally, if you have an interest in having a podcast, yes, I do think that every small business should have a podcast. I truly do, because it is a way for people to connect with your audience more on a deeper level. It's not going to be as simple as social media posts or Instagram stories. And yes, Instagram stories and social media posts have a huge place in nurturing your audience. But by having a podcast, you get to share so much deeper. So whether you are, like a sales coach like yourself, Rachel, or, like a podcast manager like me, people like we have competition in our industries. Every small business, every business has competition in their industry. And so I really think it's great to be able to stand out and have a different platform that maybe your competition doesn't have, to be able to connect with your audience deeper. Even if people learn in different ways. So like you said, you're not an audio learner. I am 100% an audio learner, 100%. But with a podcast, you can also have video learners. So people who want to watch your podcast on YouTube, they can learn that way. There's people who, you could turn your podcast into blog posts, and there's people who can read and learn. You can repurpose that into social media. So really, yes, for two reasons: to connect with your audience deeper. I think every business should have a podcast, but also because of the amount of content it gives you is insane, literally insane. So
Yeah.
that is a big reason to start a podcast as well.
Yeah. No, I feel your passion. I'm like, I feel like I need a podcast episode now because who doesn't want to come learn more about sales, right? And all
Mhm.
things business. But
Mhm.
so you say that people need a podcast. What are some things you feel that people should really consider?
Yeah, that's a great question too. So, number one, whenever I get on a call with someone who wants to start a podcast, the number one thing I ask them is, who do you want to be listening? Because
Mm,
I fear a lot of people don't think about the listener experience when they start their show. Along with this, they're not niche enough in what they're talking about. So let's say, I have someone who wants to come to me to start a podcast, and like this just happened. She's starting a mom network in the Seattle area, which amazing. I love that. I'm so excited for her to do that. And one of the things I was telling her was, you should be very specific on like who you want to be listening, because that's exactly who you'll want to join your network. So, for sales is a big topic, a huge topic. You could talk about anything within sales. But if you were to start a podcast, I would highly encourage you to focus on brick and mortar, because that's what you specialize in, and maybe even as niche as like coffee shops or like small boutiques or whatever it is. People really, I think, are afraid to go niche because it really limits the amount of listeners in their head. But at the same time, when we feel attracted to a podcast or as a creator on social media, we really love being able to really understand like what they believe in,
yeah.
what they talk about, what are their beliefs.
Right.
And when you're more niche, you're able to talk to that person more specifically. So talk to their desires, their problems. If you're too broad, you can't do it. But if you're more niche, you can
Mm,
talk exactly to their problems. And that really is powerful in getting people who really will, at the end, buy from you or connect with you or whatever it might be. So, yes, number one, if you're thinking of starting a podcast, think about who you want to be listening and what results you want to give them just by listening.
yeah. This is interesting to hear you say that because you would think, if you own a business, right? Because you said everyone should have a business, you should kind of know who your niche
Mhm.
is. But obviously, that's something that you learn through your first few years of entrepreneurship, what actually works, what doesn't, who you really want to be working with, right? It evolves. But maybe there's like a subcategory in there of
Mhm.
your clients, is kind of what I'm hearing you say, right? Is
Yeah.
that, um, to really, I agree. Like when you're listening to someone speak, you really want to feel like they're speaking to you, right? And so it's just going back to having your what ICA, right? So very interesting to hear you say that. So what are so now that you've decided you've had a podcast, you're like, I'm ready to go. I got my niche. We're good. What are some habits that have a large impact? So maybe some bad habits, like if you're hosting, you're
Mm.
inviting people on, things to kind of look for to maybe avoid.
Yes. Okay. Bad
I
habits.
know we don't
Inconsistency.
we don't like negativity. We'll talk about good habits too, but let's definitely get out of the way the things maybe to like reconsider that you might not be realizing, right?
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
inconsistency.
And
So explain
consistency
that.
is a big one.
Yeah.
So whenever someone comes to me and they're like, how often should I post my podcast? I think typical is about like once a week. That's like the typical podcast. Some do more, some do less, but honestly, whatever you're going to stay consistent with is what you should be doing. So if that's one a month, stay consistent with that one a month. You want to make sure that your audience knows when to come back, what they can learn learn from you and connect with you, and like they need consistency as much as you. So that's number one. Another bad habit. Oh my God, this one is kind of controversial, and I truly believe this, but I think a lot of podcasters forget that some people could be listening for the first time. They forget that like you might be 100 episodes into your show, but you're gonna get new listeners every episode. And sometimes the inside jokes can be a little too much, I have found.
Yeah.
So I think that as long as you remember that, like what I mean by this is if I tune into a podcast episode randomly and I don't know who they are, who they help, what they do, anything, it is hard for me to really buy into it. If they just go into a conversation with a friend, and even if that conversation's great, I'm like, who is this person? Like, who is this? So that's what I mean by that. And I do think that's a bad habit that a lot of podcasters can get into because honestly, like, your show notes might help, whatever might help, your intro might help, but really, like, think about it, really all comes back to the listener and
Mhm.
their experience.
I don't think that's controversial at all. Also, first of all, hopefully you can hear me okay. I feel like there was a little internet connection there, so I apologize if maybe something froze there for anyone that's watching or even for you, Hayleigh. Um, but you're right, like in our content too, like that's why we repeat a lot of concepts and introduce new
Hmm.
ideas and constantly reintroduce ourselves, right? And so I love that you also brought that to a podcast, right? So just because you're on episode what, like 50, it doesn't mean that everyone starts at episode one. I know I
Yeah.
certainly don't. Sometimes I read through the notes and I'm just, which topic actually interests me? Where do I want to start? I don't always start with the first episode, right? And I can't imagine that I'm the only one either. So I love that
No.
you brought that up. That's a really good reminder, is to
Hmm.
reintroduce who you are. And it's like going to an event, right? And everyone knows everyone, but you don't. And so you feel like, what am I missing here, right?
Yes.
So I think that's an excellent point that you brought up to consider. So how can someone make sure to do that?
Yeah. So I think for this example specifically, I would always have a or a recorded intro before each
Mm,
episode. So like I do this on my podcast, Employee to Boss. Of course, I can go like from my recorded intro directly into the episode, but I always record a, little bit about who the guest is, what we talk about, all of that, just to make sure that I'm introducing myself, I'm introducing the guest, I'm talking about what the guest does, what I do. And it's a great way for and it's short. It's like a minute long. It's like
right.
a minute, 90 seconds, whatever. But it does help with building that authority and instead of just throwing someone right into the episode. So not every podcast does this, but I encourage it just because
Yeah.
it does nurture a little
Yeah.
bit more.
I love the intros. It feels more professional too to hear a
Yeah.
little intro on a podcast episode, right? Because you're like, oh, okay, this is like a serious production.
Yeah.
And by like the fourth or fifth episode, you don't want to hear it anymore because you've got it down. But it's and sometimes you do. It just depends how people go about it. So I love
Yeah.
that. Great reminder. So okay, now that we know some things we don't want to do, we want to talk about things we want to do right. So I feel like a lot of a podcast episode is the conversation that you have with people. Is it engaging? Does it like flow, right? Are you having fun? Is that felt, the energy? So what would be some like questions, right? I'm the question queen. I absolutely love them. I think that they're important. So what kind of questions should you be asking people if you're the host?
Mm, I love this. So definitely asking, it depends on what podcast it's about. So I can talk about mine specifically. You were just on mine. It's a great
Mhm.
episode. So my podcast focuses on people's journey from employee to boss. That's what it's called, employee to boss. And so I asked them, the why you did this, what made you want to do this, the backstory, what do you do now? What are the action steps you take? So two important things here. Not asking close-ended questions. So always asking open-ended questions. That is very important. Some people are easier to interview than others. So sometimes this is a little bit hard to do, but it's very important to remember. And then also beyond what you're asking, I think it's what you're comprehending. So always listening to understand rather than listening to
Yeah.
respond. That is a big, big part. And it's something that I think it's a skill a lot of people should work on
It's a
just
life
in
skill.
podcasting out.
Yeah.
Right. But definitely in podcasting, because you can have a list of questions that you want to ask your guest, and they could say something so interesting. But if you're sticking to that list of questions and you don't really pick up on what their answer is, the conversation could go in a whole different way and it could be better.
Yeah.
And I think that that's a missed opportunity that a lot of podcasters they can miss out on just if they're not. And I know it's kind of a nerves thing. I see this a lot with newer podcasters too. They're like, I have this list, I'm sticking to my list. But
Right.
honestly, if you can just come up with concepts and a couple questions and just be like, I'm going into this conversation ready to learn about who this person is. It's a person that you're
Yeah.
interviewing with a whole life story
Yeah.
behind them. Like,
Uh,
there's so many cool things that you can learn from people. I love being nosy. That's probably why I'm in this field. And so be nosy about who they are, what they do, what they've accomplished,
mm,
and that's going to give you a better conversation than, like I said, just sticking to a list of specific questions.
Yeah, I think you said so many interesting things here. So first of all, I this is just the sales in me because I know we relate. This is actually in our podcast episode too that we just recorded. But the difference of what an open-ended and a closed-ended question is, because you made sure to specify that at the beginning. So I just want to make sure everyone understands the difference of that and what that actually means.
Mhm.
So, I mean, I can answer it. Maybe you can add to that too. But a good way to kind of remember that, in my opinion, is that a close-ended question closes off the conversation. So they typically start with like, is there, can I, do you, are you, right? And the response that you typically get from that is yes or no, and typically no. And so they also kind of end the conversation because you're not like having a more meaningful interaction, right? It's just very blunt. And so then I know from a sales perspective, you're like, oh my gosh, what do I say next, right? Like,
Right,
and then it
yeah.
just gets like anxious, like anxiety inducing, right? Because you're like, oh my gosh, what do I do? How do I keep this
Yeah.
flowing, right? And then the open-ended questions, right, is what opens the conversation up. And so you get a more meaningful response. They like you suggested some questions as well. It's who, what, where, when, why, how, tell me more, right? So it's getting you to actually respond to it a little bit more. And I think that when we use those questions too, it also helps us be more interested, right? Like you were
Yeah.
saying, and show curiosity. And that's where you
Mhm.
really get to better conversations. So it's something I always teach in sales. I think that when you're presenting and interacting and engaging with people, it's a great way to get there. It's absolutely like a life skill, right? Like using it in podcasts, using it with friends and family, and it can save a lot of arguments, right? So,
It can. It can.
yeah, I don't know if you have anything else you want to add to that about an open-ended or closed-ended question, but it really like is such a game changer. It's such a minor little thing that makes all the difference, in my opinion.
Totally. I mean, an example for like my podcast would be, so you started your business because you hated your job. Yes.
And they would be like, "Yes, I did." Yeah,
Or you could be like, so tell me why you started your business. I hear that your job might have been, you were mentioning that you weren't really happy there, but like tell me more. Why did you start this specific business? Obviously, it'd be a little cleaner
yeah.
than that, but no, that's exactly like the point. Like honestly, the death to podcast interviews is when someone has a one-word answer or a short answer. I can talk to a brick wall, but not a lot of people can. And so for a lot of podcasts, that would actually shut them down and be like,
Mhm.
all right, cool. Glad we had this conversation.
Yeah.
Like it just wouldn't be interesting, and the audience would be able to, if you even publish the episode, the audience would definitely be able to hear if the
Mhm.
host is uncomfortable or if the guest is uncomfortable or whatever it is. So,
Mhm.
if you are more of a introverted like type of podcast host or not very well versed in open-ended versus closed-ended questions, I would encourage you to get on a pre-call with any podcast guests that you want to have on. I think that this
Mm.
does help with kind of getting those nerves out of the way. A lot of the people that I talk to on my podcast, I've had conversations over DMs with them or over emails, but not a lot of them I've had a, talking conversation with. And that's fine for me in the way that I interview, but that's not going to be fine for everyone. So just
Yeah.
knowing that about yourself and having that built into your schedule or your process could be really helpful.
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that we hear those things more than we realize when we're actually listening. It's body language, right? It's our tone, it's our inflection, right? Even eye contact or, body posture. But that's not always seen, right? Those two things when you're listening to a podcast episode. But it can, right? Like how your voice comes out with how you're sitting. And anyways, it definitely, I think what I heard you really say is that when you say, tell me more about why this happened, right? You're inviting people to actually share their experience. You're giving them almost like permission. Whereas if you're just like, oh, I heard you lost, like you left your job. Like, tell me about that, right?
Yeah.
Or is that true, right? You're literally just asking, is that true, right? So I think we don't always realize we actually get the answers we're asking for. And so if you want a different answer, you have to change the way you go about it. And obviously that's very applicable to sales, right?
Yeah.
And so it's the same thing like I would hear in retail is when you walk in the store and someone says, is there anything I can help you find? And the answer is no, I'm just looking, right?
Right.
So it's how do you break that to get a different response? That's really like where the sales psychology comes in.
Yeah.
And communication, right, in a podcast. So the other thing I really heard you say that I actually maybe this is controversial for you, but I really like it when I'm like as a guest and someone sends out kind of a list of questions that they kind of want the conversation to go.
Mm-hmm.
Understanding that it can change, like you said, because they think you're listening, things come up that you didn't realize as they start speaking. But I know for me, it's really helpful to think through a little bit before I go on to a podcast. Like, okay, she wants me to maybe address this. I want to have a more thoughtful response on what I'm going to say. So I actually think questions ahead of time can be useful
Yeah,
because I do
definitely.
recognize people listen to it later. It lives forever. I want to make sure that I come across as professional as possible too.
Absolutely.
And not in like the sense of like you're robotic, right?
Yeah.
That's not great either, like what you said, where you're just sticking to your questions. But I think it just really helps as like a guide in preparation for the conversation.
It does. And it also helps, prep the guest, and a prepped guest is going to be better than, anything else. And it also additionally helps with if you are cutting your podcast into clips, kind of having those jumping off points, like questions and it helps people complete their thoughts as well. So definitely there is a need for having a structure to your podcast. But totally what I mean is like, don't just have a list of questions and like you're sticking to that until the end of the call. You know what I
Yeah.
mean?
Yeah. Now, the other thing that, and anybody who's jumping on and still listening, please, please do feel free to drop any questions you have in the comments. We're happy to answer them for you. Or, of course, you can always connect with either of us afterwards, and we're happy to answer them. But one thing you said earlier, Hayleigh, was you started just kind of releasing episodes, and now you're at the point where you're actually strategizing it. I think that is really the key. I've certainly seen a lot of people who get really excited. They want to start a podcast, which is super exciting, right? And needed. Like you said, all small business owners should have a podcast, but they just kind of, it's week by week or month by month. There's really not like a plan behind it. Like, I know that releasing this episode will help me this way, or I
Mhm.
have this thing coming up and I really need to make sure this type of content comes out prior, right? And forgetting that it's maybe part of the marketing campaign and really strategically thinking about that amongst your email and your newsletters and your like all the things, connecting those dots, right? And so I think that the strategy is a lot more important here than we realize. So if you could kind of share any insights or thoughts around that, that might be useful for us to consider.
Yes. Oh my gosh. I love talking about podcast strategy because it is the difference between having a podcast that doesn't convert and having one that does convert. I
Mm.
know a lot of people stop their podcasts because they're not seeing the results that they want, even though their podcast can be great, they're putting out great content, they're not having the listeners or the sales or whatever it might be. And that truly does break my heart. Because I'm like, if you just had strategy here, you could have a successful podcast that would convert for you. Easy. So, a couple things when it comes to podcast strategy is setting those goals from day one. Now, if you're listening and you already have a podcast, start now. Start now. Because if you don't have goals for your show, beyond just I want listeners or I don't know, like I want to have fun conversations. you're not going to be able to take the actions needed to be able to reach those results. So set specific goals. Like, okay, you want to have 1,000 listeners per episode. Why? What do you want those 1,000 listeners to do? You could have 5 listeners who buy from you, and that's better than having 1,000 listeners that you don't know who they are, you know?
It's
And
true.
so having those specific goals. Now, if you want to make 10 sales a month for like your online business, let's say that you sell a course, you want to make 10 course sales a month from your show. Are you talking about your course on the podcast? Do you have commercials for your course? Like what's going on here? How do they know that you have a course? Do they know that's what you want them to do? Are you inviting them? So this is kind of where sales does come in.
Yeah.
There's definitely a balance that I wanted to touch on of between like selling on your podcast. That can be a lot.
Yeah.
I see a lot of podcasters do that. It works, but at what cost? You
Yeah.
know, you're going to lose listeners. At the same time, not selling enough on your podcast is doing a disservice to yourself, because if people don't know what to buy from you, they might not even know that you sell anything. They might just be like, oh, this is Rachel. She has really good conversations about sales. Like, isn't she so smart? Yeah, she is. But like she also has ways that she can help you. And
Yeah.
so I think that that is a big part of just the whole strategy piece. I had a client come to me earlier this year, and she has like an SEO dream of a podcast name. People land on her podcast all the time that they are learning from her. She's a financial coach, like truly bringing in those listeners. And one of the issues was she wasn't talking about her offers. So she was having all of these listeners land on her show each week, coming back, but she wasn't really making sales. And
Yeah.
it was really frustrating for her because like she was getting so many listens and no sales. And so one of the things that I was immediately like, we need to switch some
Yeah.
things in here. We need some funnels. We need some content pillars, and we need some funnels. And that is going to take this to the next level where you're actually going to be able to monetize and
So good.
just help
Yeah.
more. So really that's a big piece of the strategy.
Yeah. I will say, and I love that you answered this because this was going to be like my last and kind of question here to bring it full circle is how do you really make sales from this? But I do want to kind of just add to what you're saying from what I see. Sales is so foundational, right? Like it applies in every situation, whether it's on your podcast or your face to face or your online, right? And I see often that we're afraid to sell ourselves because we don't want to be pushy or salesy or come across as sleazy, right? So to say. And so we often refrain from talking about what we do because we wait for people to come to us. But the reality is if you're not talking about what you do, you're just servicing someone, right? You're just servicing your brand. You're just servicing your business. And you're just servicing a potential customer because you have this incredible offer or this incredible service or thing that you do. And if you're not talking about it, you're not bringing justice to it, right? Like you're not showcasing just how amazing it can be, but you're also robbing someone the opportunity to fall in love with what you do or also have a solution to their need. So you never know, like, how you can change someone's life. So it really is so important to be talking about what you do and selling from that perspective. Now, you're right. I think what you said earlier about constantly talking about what you do and making that your sole focus is what is kind of transactional, right? It's what comes across as cold
Yeah.
and distant, right? People want to know that you have their best interest in mind, right? And so if all you're doing is selling, you're actually not communicating that at all, right? So there is that balance of the relationship aspect, the communication, right? The education that you're probably having in your conversations too. But really just don't be afraid to talk about what you do, right? People want to know, right? And they're investing the time to listen to you. They're there. They're in front of you. They
Yes,
chose
they
you.
are. Yes. They're already listening. You're in their head. You're in their ears. Like they're taking you on car rides. Like they are invested in who you are. That's a whole nother part that we can get
Yeah,
into of like how you need to show up
absolutely.
online as a podcast host. Oh my gosh, there's so many
Yeah.
topics that go into this, and I love answers. So anyone who's listening, you know, live or after, like come ask me questions because this is
Yeah.
like my favorite thing to talk
I
about.
love it. I do have a question for you. We did have someone, Melissa J. Virtual wants to know where do hosts find guests? So I can answer
Hmm.
that from my perspective, but you are the expert here. So I would love for if we can kind of maybe finish off our conversation with
Absolutely. Oh my gosh, that is a great question because it's so fun and there's so many different places that you can find guests as a host. So there is the old school reaching out to your connections,
that. Hmm.
messaging them, inviting them on. A more streamlined way to do it, I mean, that's number one. Obviously, ask the people in your network. And honestly, the reason I started my podcast, Employee to Boss, years ago is because I didn't have any connections in the online space. I was a new business owner. I had recently graduated college, moved to a new city, no online connections. So in my head, I was like, ha ha ha, I'll trick people into having conversations with me, and then they'll be in my network and we'll be friends, right? And so that's exactly why I started Employee to Boss. So starting off with no connections, no one that I could
Hmm.
interview, the first thing I did was go on Facebook and join Facebook groups that are
Hmm.
dedicated to helping you find guests. So there are a couple out there. If you just look up, like, message me after, but if you look up like Podcast Guest Connect or like Podcast Guest Guesting, it's a group of hundreds of thousands of people who want to be on your show. And so really being able to use that is a great way to connect. And then as I've gone along further in business, whenever I meet someone at a networking event, I invite them on my show. Whenever I meet someone
Hmm.
in online, I invite them on my show. And it takes it a step further because beyond just like a quick conversation at a networking event, we can have a longer conversation
Hmm.
at my podcast and then it's published for all to
Yeah.
hear.
Yeah. That's certainly what happened with us, right? We
It
met
is,
at
yeah.
a women's networking event and you invited me on, which was so kind of you. And we just instantly stayed connected since.
Yeah.
And I love that. So I agree with you too. I think that the first step, and this is just the sales mindset that I have, is think about who you have in your network, right? You are building relationships, right? Whether it's online or offline, right? Who can you reach out
Mhm.
to that you really value, that you devoted time to getting to know and building a relationship? And if you're really, and I hate to say this, I keep saying the word controversial, right? But if you're having a hard time finding people that you have a connection with, then I really encourage you to think about, are you actually building relationships and connections with people? Or is it just very surface level and transactional? Because
Mhm.
I think about, like, if I want to start a podcast, I think I could easily list 20, 30, 40 people that I would love to interact with, probably actually a lot more. But that's because I spent so much time building relationships with them, getting to know them, whether it's online or offline, right? Not being afraid to meet people for one on ones, learning about their business, connecting them with others. So, obviously, to me, like, that would be the first place to start, is like, who do you already know, who's in your network, or who's someone that you've kind of heard of that you admire, that you could just reach out to and say, hey, I really love what you're doing. And I think that kind of plays on what you just said on like part two, there is kind of initiating that conversation. So again, I know that sounds horrible, but if you feel like you don't have that, then you haven't connected enough with people. And so that's where working on, how am I really getting to know people around me? How am I getting to know people online? Like, even when I started online a few years ago, I didn't even realize what I was doing, but I was like, I really like you. I want to get to know you. Let's have a one-on-one on Zoom, right? And these people have stayed in my network for 4 years. I've had opportunities where, like, Diane just jumped on, right? Like, I met her through an opportunity. Oh my gosh, I just lost my AirPod. Um, so hopefully you can hear me now. But I met her through an opportunity just from a one-on-one online, right? So it's, you just like don't know where taking the time to actually get to know someone can really lead and potentially have a
Oh
guest
my
there as well.
gosh,
So
that's funny. I met Diane a couple years ago too online, and
I know,
it's
I
so
just
funny. Hey,
saw
Diane.
this comment. Yes, Diane and I know someone mutual named Catherine Beltran, so she's watching. She got mentioned. I love it, and we all met in Florida. So I mean, who knew I would end
Yes.
up in Florida from an online
Yeah,
opportunity, or to get to know Diane? So I love that. How funny, small world, right?
it really
That's the thing.
is.
When you start networking and connecting with people, you will realize like everyone knows everyone, right? And
Yes,
so, and that's not always a bad thing, right? It just, I think it really helps with your validity as well, and people trust you a little bit more.
absolutely. Absolutely. No, and I mean, by starting a podcast, you will get those all those connections. That's the number one way that I've grown my business, through connections, but also making money and getting clients and all those things. So it's helped in so many ways. And I highly encourage anyone who is thinking of starting a podcast or needs a new way to market or wants to be more of a thought leader in their space, a podcast is definitely for you.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, what a beautiful way to end that. And also, I just want to say, Melissa responded to your suggestions and said she's helping her clients find a podcast conference speaking spot. And so she felt
Nice.
this was super helpful. I think that's great feedback. Thank you. I really, really encourage you also to reach out to Hayleigh to talk through that further. That's obviously your forte. That's what you're good at and passionate about. Like, I'm excited. Now I'm like, Hayleigh, I think we need to talk after that. Genuinely. Because we'll talk about it later. But any last thoughts that we need to think about when it comes to podcast and hosting, sales, any of that kind of stuff?
Oh my gosh. I
I'm
don't
sure
know,
there are.
just do it. I mean, there's so many thoughts that I have. I'm launching a new podcast at the end of November. It's called Podcast Cafe, and it is going to be where I'm teaching about podcasting. So my thought is inviting successful podcasters into my cafe, which is just this space right here. And we're going to talk about how they did successful, they became successful in their podcast, like strategies, tips, advice, all of those things. So it's going to be a podcast about podcasting, very meta, but I am
Love it.
very excited for that just because I do think, especially, I work with men and women, but I think that the podcast space has been, there's a lot of men in here. And so I really do love being a female able to teach on podcasting and like a different way to podcast that is able to get you results, but also grow, like get you heard. That's the number one thing. So I have loved this conversation, Rachel,
Yes.
and I'll definitely, everyone who's
Yes.
listening, go listen to Rachel on my podcast too, because she had so many great things to say.
Well, thank you. I don't know if we want to answer this or maybe we come back for a part two as suggested, but the host notes wants to know, can you talk about the amount of work that goes into a podcast? And I know we touched on that a little bit at the very beginning.
Mhm.
I think, yeah, Amber is just, she's also local, so I love
Oh
that.
gosh,
But
hey.
anything you want to say, but I feel like that maybe is better for a part two. You and I could talk forever. We did this the first
We
time.
could.
Look at us, like we're into this, but
Yeah. Yeah. So I definitely think that's can definitely be part two, but I have a free podcast launch checklist. It's my website, espressopodcastproduction.com/checklist. And you can download that. It's free. And then it gives you exactly what you need to do to start a podcast. It has all the information that you actually need. When I work with my clients, just as reference, I help them start their podcast in a month. So that's what it
oh,
takes working with me. But I know some people that, have thought about starting their podcast for years, but I do think a great way to start is downloading that checklist, just seeing what you need to do, and honestly taking the first step from there.
okay. Gosh, this conversation, I know we keep going, right? This is why you listen to like understand versus respond, right? Like what we were saying at the beginning, but a month is insane, right? Like we want things so quickly to actually think that to successfully be set up takes a month. Like that's really something to think about and
Mhm.
make sure you can be consistent with, right? That kind of goes back to our beginning conversation. And just like Diane said, there isn't any work when you hire Hayleigh. Yes, that is why you delegate, right?
Yeah.
But I will say from my perspective, you can definitely tell when people put a little more attention to detail into a podcast, just the experience leading up to it, where you're recording it, how you're recording it, right? Like, do you feel taken care of, right? Because you're really putting your name out there when you do a podcast, right? Like, this is a reputation building activity. This is a needle mover for a lot of people. So, if I'm recording a podcast with you, do I know that you have my interest in mind too when you publish this? And so, with your editing and the conversation, and I think it says a lot about what happens behind the scenes too, subconsciously.
Yes,
So,
definitely.
definitely being very intentional, having the strategy, working with an expert, right? I was talking to someone this week that said, it's good to be solution oriented, right? Like, how can I resolve this? But really, the question you should be asking is, who do I need to resolve this? And I thought that was such a good mindset shift. So, if
Mhm.
you're like, this is great for you, right? Like, if you were thinking about doing a podcast and you want to know how to take it to the next level or you have questions, like, you might be that person for them. You might be that answer and not being afraid to reach out and have a conversation. So,
Absolutely.
anyways, on that note, I feel like you've given us so many fabulous resources to think about, to reach out to for that you can really help us with. How else can people find you?
Yeah, so Instagram is definitely the best place. You can come message me. My DMs are open. I love talking to everyone on Instagram. I also have a website that you can kind of learn more about me and you can download that podcast checklist from. But yeah, Instagram or coming to listen to my podcast, those are going to be the best places.
I love that. I love that. Well, Hayleigh, thank you so much for chatting with me. We really could chat forever. And
You're
I feel
good.
like we need to have a part two conversation here because podcast is, again, it's a really big topic, right? It's not always as straightforward as it seems. So I appreciate you coming on and chatting and sharing so much wonderful knowledge with us today. I hope everybody leaves inspired and ready to try that out and see what that looks like for their business and generate sales from it. So thank you.
Oh my gosh, this has been so fun. Thanks for having me on.
Yes, yes. All right, everyone, have a wonderful day. Thank you so much.